Hi, Andy.
Hi, Nan.
Great to see you today.
Nice to see you too.
So, today my guest is Andy Philpott. He's professor at the University of Auckland in New Zealand and world expert in optimization under uncertainty and its application in electricity systems. He's the director of the Electric Power Optimization Center, which has been a research leader in the field for 20 years. He has consulted on electricity optimization to many organizations throughout the world. Andy's research has been motivated by practical problems faced by industry that require some theoretical insight to resolve. This has led to a collection of theoretical publications in top OR journals. Moreover, in 2009, Andy and a team from Norske Skog were finalists in the France Animal competition for the development and deployment of Norske Skog's pivot model. Andy has been honored for his research, being awarded the Hans Dallenbach Award from the OR Society of New Zealand in 2006, elected to be an Informs Fellow in 2017 and a Simons Fellow in 2019. He has given plenary and keynote addresses to major international conferences, and he was on the editorial board of Mathematical Programming from 2004 to 2017 and has been an associate editor of operations research since 2007. He has served on numerous Informs committees and organized several international workshops and thematic programs. Andy, thank you so much for accepting the invitation. It's such an honor to have you here today.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So, your actual name is Andrew, right?
That's correct. Yeah, that's the name on my passport, but everyone calls me Andy and has done for many years, so that's the name I go by.
Mm-hmm. And where are you from in New Zealand?
I was originally born in Christchurch and lived there for about 15 years, and then we shifted to Wellington. So I spent most of the 1970s in Wellington, but now I live in Auckland.
Okay. So, Christchurch, Wellington, and then Auckland, but then in between, you went somewhere else, right?
Exactly. Yes,
Uh,
I spent time overseas.
mm-hmm. So, tell me about your family background.
So both my parents are fifth generation New Zealanders, so they've been there from have a long history of ancestors living in New Zealand. My father was an economist. Both my parents are dead. My father was an economist for his career. My mother taught reading to high school kids who had reading difficulties. And I have one older sister who's a couple of years older than me, who studied maths and biochemistry, and she was a high school math teacher, but now retired.
Mm-hmm. So you were 66, so you basically grew up in the 60s and 70s. So how was life back then, both in Christchurch and Wellington?
So it was a very enjoyable childhood. I don't think I have any bad memories of it. I was very interested in sport, played a lot of sport, and also had a fairly happy childhood at school and vacations with parents and so on. So yeah, it was very enjoyable.
So what type of sports did you practice?
So I played rugby and tennis competitively in terms of you know competition sport, but also I was very interested in other sort of recreational activities like skiing and surfing, sailing, scuba diving, those sorts of things. So yeah, as a young person, I got involved in a lot of those sorts of activities, which is very easy to do in a place like New Zealand.
Mm-hmm. Did you play any musical instruments, and what type of music did you use to listen in those days?
I learned the guitar, or taught myself the guitar. I was quite never really a very good musician, but very an assiduous one. I used to practice quite a lot without really achieving any great standard. But I used to like the music that I could play on the guitar. Paul Simon, Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, um, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, those sorts of bands. Yeah.
So more folk rock, country music, this type of
Yeah, the sort of thing that
genres.
I could try and play myself was the music that I like to listen to.
Do you still play nowadays?
I do, still quite poorly, but yeah, I have my daughter has a partner who's a very good guitarist, so I feel somewhat humbled in his presence. But I try and play with him occasionally.
Uh-huh. New Zealand is quite isolated from the rest of the world, geographically speaking. And to what extent this has affected you at the time?
Well, as I said, in the 1960s, I was pretty young, so I didn't really notice it that much. I think in the 70s, it was something that one became aware of. I mean, there was always a slight delay in things happening in the Northern Hemisphere before they got accepted in New Zealand. So we were always slightly behind in terms of social norms, fashions, and so on. But in the 70s, by the time the 70s came, we had American television and European television. So we were really up to date in terms of learning about things. It's just that the physical manifestations of them, like for example, new cars and clothing and so on, would not arrive for some months, and that would be a problem. Not for me. I didn't really care too much about that.
Right. But did you have the chance to travel to the Northern Hemisphere when you were young?
Yeah, we did. In 1967, my father had a sabbatical. He was an economist, an academic in the university in Christchurch, and he had a year's sabbatical, which he spent 3 months of in Cornell, in Ithaca at Cornell University, and another 3 months working for the EU in Rome. So he took our whole family, my sister and me and my mother, with him, and we got a chance to tour around the US and also to go and live in Rome for 3 months.
Okay.
So yeah, that was very good fun. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did you visit other places in the US?
Apart from New York, yeah, we went on a road trip out to California. Drove to California and back, which was I guess like a month-long trip, which was sightseeing, but also he was visiting universities at various places en route. But that was always great. That was great fun for us too, as kids, because the US was something that we'd seen a lot of on television and read a lot about, and so going there as a 10-year-old was really amazingly thrilling.
Uh-huh. So you went to California?
We went to California, by road. So we drove across through the Midwest to California and then back again. Didn't spend much time in California. I do remember going to San Francisco. It was 1967, and one would imagine that it would have been the summer of love and so on. But in fact, there were virtually no evidence of hippies at all, apart from in Haight-Ashbury. We drove there in a bus to go sightseeing, and the bus driver pointed out the hippies, who were there. So it was kind of, yeah, it was a view of the 1960s that I remember, which sort of doesn't really mesh with what most people think California was like in 1967. But I mean, it was actually quite a lot more conservative in my memory than what you hear in the popular press.
So did you go to San Francisco with flowers in your head?
I think I had a crew cut at that point, so flowers didn't really go with it.
Yeah. Okay, so did you have the chance to visit other countries too?
We also went to the UK, and I remember going to Cambridge and being really taken with the spires of Cambridge, and I kind of I don't know whether I made a mental note at that point, thought this would be a great place to come to study if I ever got the chance. I was only 11 years old, so I'm not sure that ambition was kind of a realistic one, but I think I did make some, had some vision that this would be an aspiration to try and meet.
Wow, very nice. You have a BA in philosophy, which is somehow unusual for an OR person. What motivated you to pursue this degree?
So I took philosophy in my first year at university. I guess it was when I was in my final year at school. I had a history teacher who asked me to write an essay about John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, who were two political philosophers in the 17th century. We were studying the English Revolution, and the teacher said, why don't you write an essay on these two gentlemen, and I went away, didn't know anything about philosophy, and started reading what they'd written, and became quite fascinated by this whole subject that I had really no acquaintance with. So I learned that you could study at a university, and in my first year I took a course in philosophy and got very interested in logic. I also took mathematics in my first year, and some science courses, but I got very interested in logic and decided to pursue that as a major at the university.
Yeah, so you're interested in philosophy, logic. I wonder if you liked Bertrand Russell, for example.
Yeah, we studied Bertrand Russell. I mean, things like the liar paradox, which of course, we as logicians you study in great detail, and Gödel's incompleteness theorem, all of these things which I found really, really interesting as an undergrad at university. And I really enjoyed university. In my first 2 or 3 years, and thereafter I enjoyed it, but I was kind of completely taken by the contrast with high school. It was a completely different learning environment, and I didn't think I would enjoy it as much as I did. I really found it very, very enjoyable. So, and the freedom of choice to study whatever you wanted, and which was not the case at school, where you were kind of a lot more constrained. I thought it was really wonderful.
You probably studied philosophy of sciences as well, like Karl Popper.
Yeah, I did a course in philosophy of science. In that I found interesting. Studying the Thomas Kuhn, the science of the structure of scientific revolutions, and Karl Popper and Quine and so on. There's lots of interesting people in that space. And I had done some science, was also doing some physics courses. So reading some philosophy of science, I thought, gave me a very nice perspective on those other courses.
Yeah, absolutely. Eventually, you ended up obtaining a B.Sc degree with honors in math. Did you get tired of studying philosophy?
Well, I guess not really. I took a math course, as I said, in my first year, and I tried to do maths as part of my logic degree going through, but my maths courses were very much pure, and I focused very much on pure maths, algebra, and so on and so forth. In as much, and also there were some logic courses in mathematics, which were related to the philosophy degree. But I guess what happened was I figured out that I could get a BA and a B.Sc in 4 years. So I kind of solved an optimization problem to maximize the number of degrees in 4 years, and that was the solution to it, was to get both degrees. And then at the end of that period, I decided to major in mathematics. So I went and did a final year honours in mathematics. So that was my 5th year.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned optimization. So when did OR came into the picture in your life?
Actually, it was in that year when I studied my honours year. I took an optimization course, which was very much focused on nonlinear programming, classical unconstrained and constrained nonlinear programming, the Karush-Kuhn-Tucker conditions and so on, or Kuhn-Tucker conditions as they were called in 1978. Karush hadn't kind of emerged at that point in those conditions, but I really enjoyed that paper, and I became very interested in variable metric algorithms for unconstrained optimization, the work of Michael Powell and Roger Fletcher, and BFGS algorithm and so on, and decided that would be a direction I wanted to go in the future.
Okay, so that's quite interesting. So the entrance was through nonlinear programming, the classical optimization instead of linear programming, right?
Yes.
But did you study the simplex algorithm too at the time, or only later?
Only later. I did a course in so what happened was I finished my honours degree, and I was very fortunate getting a scholarship to go to the UK, and then I had 6 months before that course began. So then I did some OR papers. I discovered there was some OR courses which I hadn't known about at the university, And since I was going to Cambridge to do an OR degree, I thought I would do some preparation, and then I encountered the simplex method and other OR tools, which helped me further down the track. I have to say, my father was an economist. He was very much involved in economic planning. So even though I wasn't familiar with the simplex method, he was using these tools in his economic modelling work, using linear programming and economic, general equilibrium modelling as part of his work. But I was not really, I guess, working in that space with him so much.
Very interesting. Were you exposed to computers and programming at that time?
Well, actually, my first exposure, I have to say, was when I was about 8, when my father took me and my sister into the department in Christchurch to show us the new computer that they'd bought, big mainframe, and it had some sort of very primitive kind of conversational. I hesitate to say AI. It was kind of a conversational program. You could talk to the computer and talk back in a very stilted way, which was kind of fascinating. But then when I did my first year at university, I decided to do computer science as one of my papers, and that was in 1974. We had to write algol code on punch cards. It was like a 24-hour turnaround for the punch cards going into the computer system, and I got completely turned off computers and decided I wouldn't do any computer science at all. And I didn't do any for like 5 years after that, because until computers became a lot more friendly.
Okay. So it was not love at first sight after all.
It was not love at first sight. No, I didn't like the environment at that time.
So did New Zealand have an active OR society or group in the 1970s?
They did. It was very active, and in fact, a lot more active than it is at the moment. I'm ashamed to say, it was Hans Dallenbach, who you mentioned, was a professor in Christchurch, and he had a very, very strong group of good people working in OR there. Auckland, there are a couple of people, David Ryan and Merv Rosser, who worked in Auckland, and Wellington had a guy called Tony Vigno, and then there was a group in the what's called the DSIR, which was a government organisation who worked on operations research. So I was very active in the 70s. I was, as I said, I didn't really encounter OR until 1979, so I kind of wasn't really involved with those guys at all until I came back to New Zealand in the 80s, and then I engaged with them. But at that time, it was very active, yeah.
Right. How did you manage to go to the UK for higher studies?
Well, as I said, I was very lucky in being awarded a Commonwealth scholarship. I really only wanted to go to the UK for 1 year, so I enrolled in a Master of Philosophy in Control Engineering and Operational Research. It was cool. And the scholarship paid for my fees and travel and so on to go and do that. So, yeah, I was very lucky.
Is it true that your main goal was to join the rugby team in Cambrige?
Yeah, I was probably a bit deluded there. I went over there with that in mind, and I tried out for the Blues team and didn't get very far. I think my aspirations were a lot higher than my ability. No, I didn't make that team, but I did play for Churchill College on their team, and I played rugby league, which is a kind of a different sport, but related to rugby for the university. So I got, I guess, as close as my ability enabled me to.
Okay. What were the requirements to earn the Masters of Philosophy or Mphil degree there in Cambridge?
The Mphil was a coursework masters, and there was a dissertation, like a one-term dissertation. So we had a lot of courses in OR, some of which I found straightforward because I'd done that material, but also courses in control engineering, which I found quite new and a bit more challenging. But so it was kind of quite a eclectic mix of material. I mean, there was a lot of classical OR stuff, but then control engineering involved, working with transfer functions and Lyapunov stability, and a lot of optimal control, stuff which you wouldn't typically find in an OR degree.
Mm-hmm. And what was your master's dissertation about?
So my master's dissertation was motivated by a problem that Peter Nash, my supervisor, told me about, which was distributing water from the British waterways, canals. They used to have these reservoirs, and they would release water through locks into the canals to ensure there was enough water in the canals for canal boats to travel. So there's sort of random inflows to these reservoirs, and then you had to basically decide how much water to release into the canals and which reservoirs to release it from. So it was a kind of control problem. And I realized this could be formulated as a max flow problem, but I kind of was interested in doing it in continuous time with the storage in the reservoirs. So I looked at that problem and then thought, I can generalize the labeling algorithm of Ford and Philpott into continuous time with some appropriate approximations of the continuous time functions that I'm going to use, and as maybe piecewise linear functions. And I got this kind of algorithm working, and then Eddie Anderson, who was another lecturer there, got interested in this, and then we ended up writing a paper together on the max flow algorithm and a max flow min-cut theorem that was derived in continuous time. So that was sort of the beginning of my sort of love affair at that time with continuous time optimization.
Yeah, sounds fascinating. And you mentioned that you had to make an algorithm work. So were you comfortable to write computer programs after arriving at University of Cambridge? That's
a good question. I was kind of dreading it a bit, given my previous experience with the punch cards and all in Wellington, but Cambridge was wonderful. They had in 1979 when I got there, they had these microprocessors, computer automation LSI 4/30, I think they were, which won't mean anything to your listeners, but they were like these microprocessors which were connected up to oscilloscopes. And there were some very clever engineers in the engineering school there who had devised Fortran compilers for these kind of microprocessors, but also they had written word processors, and you could do mathematical symbols which would be displayed on the oscilloscope. So it was like a WYSIWYG word processor. This is 1979. This is 5 years before the Mac. The Macintosh came. Mm-hmm. They're virtually doing very similar things to the Mac on these microprocessors. So I suddenly got very enthusiastic about coding. I had my own desktop microprocessor to work on. I could use that exclusively. No one else had access to it. It had floppy disks. I could just save all my stuff, and I could work on my own time, and I didn't have to rely on a high priesthood of computer operators who would give me my punch cards 24 hours later when I could do it all on my own machine. So this was a revelation. And the word processor, I mean, if I look at my Mphil dissertation, now 40 years later, it has all this beautiful mathematics in it. We had this not the mathematics is beautiful, but the actual typography is beautiful. We had a double daisy wheel printer, and so you could then print out without getting a secretary to do it. You could print out on all this beautifully word processed mathematics with all the Greek symbols and so on this double daisy wheel printer to produce really nice typewritten text. Yeah. So it was a great thing to have that, and I think it sort of changed the way I worked. I mean, I remember, if I can jump forward, when I went to MIT later, then I remember writing math papers there and giving them to a secretary to type up, and I found that very, very cumbersome because she would type them up and then give them back to me, and I would check them. But here, the WYSIWYG way of doing it, of composing at the keyboard, completely changed the way I wrote, and it was a real revelation.
Yeah, it should have been a very exciting period, right? So tell me about your PhD work now.
So at the end of my Mphil, I had we wrote this paper together, which we sent off to Math of OR, and it was accepted. And I thought this is only just the beginning of a whole body of work that one could do in this space. And so I convinced my supervisor to write me a strong letter to say he thought I should stay and do a PhD. And I then convinced the Commonwealth Scholarship Authority to provide another 2 years of funding, which I was incredibly grateful for, because I realised it would not happen today, but at that time they seemed fairly conducive to doing that. So they said, yes, we'll reluctantly agree to fund you for another 2 years. And so I then started working on other sort of versions of optimization problems that maybe could be amenable to continuous time, the development of continuous time algorithms. So we looked at transportation problems, mainly problems with the network structure. The key idea was that the network structure enabled you to derive algorithms that were highly structured themselves, and that led to kind of much higher likelihood of getting something that could be implementable on the computer. And there was work being done at the same time. George Danzig and his students were working on continuous time linear programming on a general, trying to generalize the simplex method as continuous time. It's much more challenging than doing it with network problems. So our approach was to kind of focus on networks and try and get those to work. So that was a focus of the PhD, and we had some success, I think.
That's great. Did you stay in the UK after completing your PhD?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. So when I was doing my PhD, I met Gil Strang, who's a professor of maths at MIT, who was visiting Cambridge, and we got chatting about various things which he was and I were interested in, and he offered me a postdoc when I finished at MIT. So I went to the math department at MIT. I taught his linear algebra course, which I really enjoyed, because he's got a great textbook in linear algebra that most of your listeners will know about, and the students were really great. So I taught there for a year, but discovered when I arrived there, very shortly after arriving there, that Clare College had offered me a research fellowship back in the UK. So I delayed that for 6 months and spent a year in the US, and then went back to Cambridge to Clare College for another 2.5 years.
Right. So in what topics did you work on after returning to Cambridge?
So I went to back to Clare College, and as I said, I worked on the continuous time network optimization. And one of the things that occurred to me on returning to Cambridge was the network simplex method was an example of a simplex method with a network structure. So that seemed to me to be the next thing to try and develop an algorithm for. So I spent maybe a year and a half developing an implementable algorithm for the network based on the network simplex method for min-cost network flow problems in continuous time with storage. So that was quite a complicated project, and it was much more difficult than I first thought. But there was a paper in Networks that Eddie Anderson and I wrote that kind of described that algorithm. At the same time, I had some students. I had a Michael Ferris, who's now a professor in Madison, was an undergrad in Cambridge, and I persuaded him to do a master's degree. And in 1984, under my supervision, and in 1984 we got a preprint from Gil Strang, who'd been to a seminar in MIT given by Narendra Karmarkar on Karmarkar's interior point algorithm, and he very kindly sent me a preprint of this. So Michael Ferris and I worked a lot on trying to implement that and seeing whether we could beat the simplex method like everyone else was doing at that time.
The 80s was a busy period for linear programming, and around that time you published that paper, right, entitled "On the Performance of Karmarkar's Algorithm." Do you have any more memories from that period?
I have lots, but maybe it's not worth traversing all of them. Michael and I worked on this based on the preprint that Gil had sent me, and a couple of months later, the news broke in the New York Times and Time magazine about this algorithm, and no one in the UK knew about it apart from me, because I'd been working on it. And so I got quite a bit of publicity, quite fortuitously, and thanks very much to Gil for the heads up. I got a lot of publicity, wrote an article for New Scientist, and went to the Royal Society and gave a presentation on the work that Michael and I have been doing. I was a very junior researcher, but was quite flattered to be in the company of people like Mike Powell and Martin Beale and so on, some of the the giants of the optimization field in the UK who were also at that meeting. So it was really a thrill to do that. We didn't. It was kind of interesting. We didn't really ever get it to work the way we'd hoped. And talking to Mauricio Resendi, actually last year I was at Amazon and I spoke to him about what the work he'd been doing at Bell Labs and with Karmarkar and at Berkeley, and he was saying there were lots of tricks that they put into that, which we knew about but thought we could emulate. And of course, the tricks were way more sophisticated than our meager numerical analysis could master. So I think it was a great time, a really good fun. It really changed the whole landscape of math programming, and so it was exciting to be a part of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mauricio Rezende spoke about that event in his episode on Subject 2, so I'm quite familiar with the story. And I'm impressed that you got the news about the Karmarkar's algorithm before it was published. So you kind of had a spoiler of what was coming next, right? Yeah. Yeah,
it was something before it went public. I think it was like I maybe said a month or something. It was probably less than that. It was in advance. And I remember reading it and talking to Michael about it and thinking, oh, we should try and implement this. And then the news came out, it was made public, and we had, I guess, some advanced knowledge. So that was very helpful to us.
Yeah. Did you attend the legendary 1985 ISMP conference in Boston?
I did attend that meeting. That was the first ISMP that I went to, in fact. And it was a very exciting meeting. Of course, George Danzig was there, and Leonid Katorovich was there as a speaker, and Karmarkar was there, of course, as well. So three of the giants of linear programming. I remember seeing them all standing together at the front of a room once, and I thought I wish I'd taken a photo of it. It was a very historic occasion to see the three of them standing in a group together. But yes, very exciting.
So you saw them at the same time, the three of them talking?
Three of them standing together, chatting. So
wow.
About, I'm not sure what, but possibly linear programming. And there was a lot of controversy, I guess, at that meeting, because people were trying to emulate Karmarkar's results that he'd published, or hadn't published but announced, of improving on the simplex algorithm on many benchmarks and benchmark problems. And the Stanford group, Margaret Wright, Mike Saunders, Philip Gill, and Walter Murray had worked on this. And
the Gang of Four, right?
The Gang of Four. They'd written a paper where they'd called this a barrier method because they'd identified that the rescaling that was going on in Karmarkar's method was actually equivalent to a log barrier method. And so
yeah, it was shown later, right? But it took a while for the community to digest that. So yeah.
Yeah, so I remember Narendra Karmarkar standing up and after Margaret Wright's lecture saying, "Why are you calling it the barrier method? It's actually Karmarkar's method." And so there's quite a bit of a standoff there, which was kind of entertaining, I guess.
Yeah, there were heated discussions.
It was a very interesting time. Michael Ferris came too as a student, and we were talking. We met up with Irv Lustig, who worked a lot with Bob Vanderby and others on implementations, and so we met all the people who were working in this space, which is really good fun.
Yeah. So Karmarkar gave a talk, and then Margaret Wright also gave one, and at some point there were heated discussions, right? And so that's what makes this conference really game changer and really important in our field, right? And I mean, it's fantastic that you had a chance to be there.
Yeah, no, it was interesting because there was a very divided opinion at that time about whether this was genuine or whether in fact it was something that was AT&T had done for publicity, and that whether it was just going to fade away as a curiosity. I mean, people had, of course, read about Katian's algorithm, which was also polynomial but didn't work very well in practice. So they had suspicions that maybe this was just another thing like that, which would have been a contribution, but not really the breakthrough that Karmarkar was claiming. And but time has shown that actually it was a watershed moment. It really changed the whole nature of optimization and math programming, and the whole interior point revolution, of course, led to solving conic problems and semi-definite programming problems, and all the work of Nemirovsky and Nesterov and looking at self-concordant barrier functions. All of this stuff emerged out of that one discovery. So I think that it was a watershed moment, looking back in hindsight.
Yeah. So why did you decide to return to New Zealand?
I guess, that was a difficult decision, but there were family reasons. My parents were getting older and I wanted to spend time with them. A job opportunity came up at Auckland, which had not in optimization, and there hadn't been any job opportunities or job advertisements for like 5 or 10 years. I hadn't seen any, so I thought this would be one opportunity to return to New Zealand. I decided to make that move. To be honest, I thought it probably was a temporary thing. Maybe I would try it for 4 or 5 years and then maybe move back to the Northern Hemisphere. But as things turned out, I got married, had family, and I've been here ever since.
Yeah. So you've been talking about continuous time linear programming, continuous time network design and algorithms, but then you switched direction. And what motivated you to start studying stochastic programming?
Good question. Yeah. So when I got back to Auckland, I continued looking at continuous linear programming and pursuing that. I had a couple of students who I supervised on that topic. But the rest of the department I was working with were very much working in applications. So the professor here at the time, David Ryan, was a very strong advocate for applying OR in practice, and he was very good at that. And he convinced me that, though he thought the continuous time linear program was interesting theoretically, that it wasn't really something I should pursue in New Zealand if I wanted to advance my career in New Zealand, because so I secretly continued working on that, but I decided I needed another direction, and he was working in aircrew scheduling. I kind of started to look at that, and I decided that wasn't really for me. It was kind of zero integer programming. And then Roger Wetz came here and visited just by chance and gave a talk in our department, and stayed with my wife and me for a couple of nights. And I got talking to him about OR and so on, and he gave this talk about the progressive hedging algorithm, which is a method he and Terry Rockefeller invented in the late 80s for taking a deterministic optimization problem and then saying, suppose there's some uncertainty in the parameters, how do you convert that to a stochastic, how that deterministic algorithm to an algorithm that will solve the stochastic problem, right? So regressive hedging is this method, the decomposition method they came up with, and many of your readers, your listeners will know about it. But anyway, he gave a talk about this in 1989, and I was really taken with this and thought, yes, this is the area I want to work in. I could see lots of problems in New Zealand that would benefit from stochastic optimization models, and so I thought, and no one else in our department was doing that, so I thought this is an area I should focus on. So I moved sort of sideways and started working in that area a lot more.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Andy, there are distinct ways of using stochastic programming to solve optimization problems under uncertainty. For example, one can employ classical approaches like the L-shaped methods over a limited number of scenarios, or one can develop sampling-based algorithms. Then you have the stochastic dual dynamic programming algorithms, the SDDP, famous one by Brazilian researcher Mario Veiga Pereira, and so on. So when to use each of these different methods, when to use the right hammer to address the right problem. Because when you talk about stochastic programming, there's just too many things, right?
Yeah, well, that's a very big question, Anand, and I'm not sure I can do it justice in a 5-minute kind of answer, or even a
no. Take your time. Take your time, please.
But I think so. First of all, what is stochastic programming? So there are kind of different definitions of this. Some people say stochastic programming builds a tree and solves a problem as a deterministic equivalent linear optimization problem in a tree. So the stochastic programming community who work in this area has a much broader church than that. I mean, we talk about all sorts of stochastic optimization methodologies and approaches for solving problems, and these are going to depend on the particular model that you're looking at. So, first of all, one criticism of scenario trees is that where do you get the scenario tree from? Okay, so one approach is to say, well, you construct it. You take some data and you look at trying to construct a tree that has certain properties that match the data, like has the same moments, first and second moments, or whatever. And that's okay, and it kind of works. But if the dimension of the random variable is very large, then you're going to run into difficulty. Just computing an expectation of a function of a random variable that has high dimension is impossible unless you do something like Monte Carlo, right? So then you have to say we have to sample to get any hope of getting a low error kind of estimate of the number you're trying to optimize. So that's kind of leads you to kind of a different paradigm. So, but there's something in the first approach which is is not completely without merit. I mean, I think that's the thing. I mean, you can say, well, actually, you would never do that because you take a random variable with 20 components, then you're never going to be able to compute the expectations if you do that. Right? But suppose you're looking at a problem, some of the problems we've been looking at, where you have a 50-year, or you're looking at planning for 2050. What's the world going to look like in 2050? What I want to do is plan the expansion of renewable energy to meet demand for 2050. I have no idea what the demand is going to be like in 2050, and I don't know what a probability distribution of that is because I have no data for that really. I can maybe forecast it, but even that's kind of highly problematic. So you've got to take some educated guesses about what the world might look like, and there'll be different outcomes for that, different scenarios, and you can assign likelihoods to those if you want to, but let's not call them probabilities. Let's just think about different states of the world, and you want to make a sequence of decisions now and going forward that somehow is robust and flexible enough to deal with those different states of the world. And then a scenario tree kind of makes sense, right? So in those sorts of models, a scenario tree will be the right sort of approach. Now there are other models where like you talk about SDDP, which is in terms of hydro scheduling. So Mario Pereira's paper describes this as an optimization. I'm not sure what his paper does, but many people do. They describe this as an optimization problem in a scenario tree, which is very, very large. It has 10 to the power of 50 kind of outcomes, right, or scenarios, just enormous, right? And so they treat it as this problem in a tree as a nested decomposition method. I don't think that's very fruitful at all. I think stochastic optimization in that setting is more about stochastic control, and that is more about dynamic programming. So SDDP is essentially an approximation of a dynamic programming type of methodology. So to say, well, it's not stochastic programming. Well, it is kind of stochastic optimization, but it's not really in the tree paradigm, right? It's built around a stochastic programming paradigm and using independence of the random variables to kind of get you some leverage in terms of how you do that stochastic programming, and there's sampling and all that built into it, but it's essentially a stochastic programming methodology, a stochastic dynamic programming methodology, I should say. So my answer to the question is, what should you use? Well, it depends on the problem setting, and one should be entirely eclectic in choosing the methodology, because there are a whole lot of different communities that use different methodologies here, and they're all suited to different kind of environments, and you should choose the right approach for the right environment.
Yeah, there's also the issue of being aware or not about the ground truth distribution that also might affect a lot the way in which you solve the problem, right?
Yeah, so the ground truth distribution, if we talk about the 2050 planning problem, I'm not sure it makes sense to talk about a ground truth probability distribution there. Maybe it does, but that would be much more sensible if you were doing something over and over again, if you're repeating, like solving a news vendor problem with random demand periodic, every day. And so, we know, we can solve that problem analytically for a ground truth distribution using a quantile. But, if you were solving that using, for example, sample average approximation, then you have to bear in mind, how will that method perform, under different assumptions about the ground truth distribution. And, there is some interesting recent work that says, well, sometimes it doesn't perform that well. If the ground truth distribution has very high right skew, then sometimes you can get solutions to these stochastic optimization problems with samples that actually don't perform that well out of sample. So yes, I think this is an interesting question. One can talk about it at much greater length, but I should say I think this is something that the stochastic programming community is starting to have learned recently from the machine learning people, that there is this idea of testing your policies out of sample and seeing how well they go, and it's not always the case that they do as well as you think they're going to do.
Right. So what are the open research questions regarding stochastic programming, in your opinion?
Well, it's another big question. So one thing is, I mentioned this idea of people think stochastic programming is the idea of a tree, and that kind of view of the field became popular, I think, or became widespread in the 1990s, when the community was sort of working in that paradigm. And there was quite a small community working in that paradigm, to be honest. There was not that many people. Now everyone's solving problems under uncertainty, right? It's become, everyone in math programming is trying to deal with uncertainty in some setting. So it's become kind of ubiquitous. So there's a lot of communities working in this area. And so if you talk about open problems, each of those communities will have their own open problems. So I'm not familiar with all of those communities individually. I'll tell you what I think, for me, the interesting problems are, which is still kind of open, and then maybe that can be enough. So one thing I've been looking at recently is this problem of multi-horizon scenario trees. So these are multi-stage problems over long decision horizons where there are multiple timescales. So in electricity, for example, which is my area, you want to decide how to expand the capacity of all your generation plant over, say, a 30-year time horizon. And then you look at what happens in each year. You've got another stochastic optimization problem, which has uncertain wind and failures of plant and so on. You've got another stochastic optimization problem that uses that plant optimally. So there's a different time scale there that's embedded within the coarser time scale. And these problems, these are really important problems for us to grapple with. We have to solve these if we're going to figure out how to decarbonize. So that's an area, I think, where people have, algorithmically, people, I think, are not really haven't really grasped that nettle and figured out how to do that. So I think there's a big opportunity there. There's also an opportunity there in understanding risk, because we've got different timescales. You have kind of risk happening at different levels of kind of discretization. So you think about over 50 years, you think, what's the risk that if we don't do this, that we're going to have a climate crisis? What's the risk? What's the risk that the cost of lithium, or the availability of lithium, is going to be severely curtailed? What's the risk of some event like the invasion of Ukraine happening? All of these things are very, very hard to kind of quantify. And then there's the kind of short-term risk. I'm operating a hydro system. I've got a risk of weather, the rain not happening, and I'm going short of water. And then there's the risk of the wind not blowing when I've got high demand. So all of these things kind of have to be factored in by people making investments. And I don't know really how to do that in a way which is kind of principled. So I think that's a very big and unsolved problem that we have to grapple with.
Okay, so since you've been talking about applications and open questions in the field of stochastic programming, let's break some of them down. I know you've done a lot of work. You have a large amount of papers published in the topic. So could you first talk about your work involving hydroelectricity markets?
Sure. Okay, so I've got to be a little bit careful here, because I've worked in electricity markets and I've worked in hydroelectricity optimization, and there are many countries in the world that have electricity markets and no hydro, and countries like Brazil, your country, that has not really a wholesale electricity market but have a hydroelectricity system. In New Zealand, we have both, so the two are kind of related. So I think probably I should talk first of all about hydroelectricity optimization, which is kind of the problem of deciding how to release water from reservoirs over kind of several periods of time in order to meet demand at least cost. So this problem is a stochastic control problem, right? You have a state variable, which is the amount of water in each reservoir, and you have controls, which are what you release from those reservoirs. And it's stochastic because the inflows into the reservoirs are random. This is a problem you in Brazil and will be very familiar with.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the most popular technique for solving these sorts of problems is called STDP. It was developed by one of your countrymen who you mentioned, Mario Pereira. And I should talk a little bit about my history of working on this. I've met Mario several times and we get on quite well. He had a colleague, Tom Halliburton in New Zealand, who was very keen on implementing STDP for the New Zealand system back in the 1990s, very shortly after it was developed. And Tom approached me to work on a project with a student to look at this. So we did this in 1995 and studied and learned about the algorithm and implemented it in a very crude way. But then in 1996, New Zealand formed the wholesale electricity market, where the industry saw no need for the software, because this is a social planning model. It's for planning the whole system, and they were broken up into individual generators who were only interested in maximizing their own operating surplus, not on operating the system, right? So I sort of left it at that point for a few years and then came back to it in the early 2000s when I had another student who was looking at optimizing the production and sales of dairy products with a dairy company in New Zealand. And this could be solved using STDP. So we developed an ample model for this, ample code for STDP. And we wrote a paper in 2008 that sort of showed, what conditions you need on the sampling process in STDP to ensure the algorithm would converge to the right answer, right? So this was a kind of a paper that effectively took what was out there in the folklore, which people kind of assumed but hadn't really formalized, and made a formal argument to say this is when it will converge and this is when you have to be careful when it will not converge. So that was in 2008, and then I had a visit from Vito de Martis, who's one of your countrymen from Florianopolis, as a PhD student, and we worked on a code that he had developed in C++, which we then ported to something called DOSA in New Zealand, which was developed by Jeff Pritchard, my colleague, and I. And then we licensed this to the New Zealand Electricity Authority for use in looking at security of supply, not so much in the market, but just seeing how secure the supply of hydroelectricity was. So after DOSA, I had another student, Oscar Dowson, and another student, Leah Kaplovich, and Oscar developed a Julia code called stdp.jl, which has now become very popular. And we took that on and replaced DOSA with stdp.jl because it was about the same speed as the C++ code, a little bit slower, but had greater flexibility, as you might understand. So this is all based around Julia, the Julia language, and the JUMP modeling language that Oscar also is in charge of. So that's something we use now exclusively. So yeah, that's the history of SDDP.
Yeah, that's great. So there have been plenty of recent models in the literature addressing the issue of decarbonization of energy systems, as well as the problem of optimizing transmission capacity extension that you already mentioned. Tell me about your contributions in these areas.
Yeah, so I started working in this renewable energy area in terms of decarbonisation when I was engaged as a consultant by the Interim Climate Change Commission back in 2016, before the Climate Change Commission was set up as a body in New Zealand. This Interim Climate Change Commission was set up to investigate the feasibility of New Zealand becoming 100% renewable in electricity. So we're closing down all our gas and coal plants. So I worked on this problem with Michael Ferris, who was visiting me on a sabbatical, and another colleague, Tony Downward, and developing multi-horizon models for this problem. And part of it was motivated by this Climate Change Commission question, but also we were interested in how you would decarbonise over long time horizons, as I was talking about before. The kind of, I guess, the key takeaway from our research was that, and it was kind of obvious when we started this, but we wanted to get a model to confirm it, was that going 100% renewable was very expensive. So closing down that last gas plant suddenly increased the cost enormously. And the reason is, in New Zealand, we have no opportunity to import power. We're 2 islands, we're isolated, and it's a bit like Brazil in the sense that you can't import power from other countries. So, when you get short of energy, you have to generate using a source that's dispatchable, like gas or coal, if there's very little water supply or the reservoirs are low. So, so that if you can't do that, you have to shed load, and that's very expensive. Either that, or you have to overbuild, wind. It's also very expensive. So, the idea of going to 100% renewable energy by capacity, renewable electricity, I should say, by capacity, is very, very expensive. And our model showed this. And I think the other folk on the Climate Change Commission kind of, I think, understood this, and the model confirmed it. And the government has consequently backtracked on this aspiration, and they're saying, we realise that some gas plant may have to be remain in order to keep the system going, and we can make reductions in carbon emissions in other areas like agriculture and transport much more cheaply than having 100% renewable electricity. So that's, I think, was an outcome of that, and we're continuing to work on that with Michael and also with folk in the Climate Change Commission.
Right. I noticed that you have been working on perfect competitive equilibrium with risk-averse investors to social planning problems. Could you elaborate more on this, please?
I hope you really want to hear this, but yeah, I can. Okay. So I mentioned SDDP, right, as being a technology that is used in places like Brazil that really don't have a market. You use that to compute prices and then tell generators what to generate. In New Zealand, generators aren't really interested in that. They want to maximize their own profits. And so the question is, what's the point in having something like SDDP as a social planning model? Well, it turns out that if all the agents in the market, the generators and consumers and so on, are risk neutral, in other words, they just maximize their expected rewards, then, and they're perfectly competitive, so they're price takers, and markets for things are complete. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that everything that you want to constrain or it has a price that you can, an instrument you can trade in the market, and there's a price that's settled by the market. So here's an example. Suppose you had two reservoirs owned by different agents, one upstream of the other one. Then you're going to have to kind of coordinate the water release from the top guy to the bottom guy. And if they're independent agents, then effectively there has to be a payment from one guy to the other. It's a price for the water transfer. And if there isn't that price for the water transfer, no market for that, where that price is settled, then you can get inefficiencies because you have to get some way of deciding what the optimal level of water transfer between those two agents is. So if that complete market means there's a price for that thing that's settled in the market, and those agents will pay it. So if that happens, then you can show that an SDDP solution generates a perfectly competitive equilibrium. Major problem is that all the agents in the market are essentially risk averse. So that theorem, that welfare theorem that says the optimization problem gives you a competitive equilibrium, it does not apply. And so how do you do that? Well, it turns out there is some theory that enables you to do that, but you have to use very specific models for risk. You have to use models of risk that are essentially convex. And the paper that does this uses what are called coherent risk measures that have another condition on them, but these are essentially convex measures of risk. So the theorem, there are several theorems on this. One theorem by Danny Ralph and Eve Smears says in a two-stage setting, if everyone has a coherent measure of risk and they're optimizing using that, and they are perfectly competitive, so they're price takers, they're not trying to influence price by their actions, and the markets for things like water transfer are complete, and moreover the markets for risk are complete. What does that mean? That means agents can trade different risk positions with each other at certain prices. They can trade outcomes in states of the world. So I can sort of swap a sort of bad outcome in my world for a good outcome in your world at a certain price. And there's a price in the market that enables that trade. Then these welfare theorems apply. So the welfare theorems essentially say, well, okay, what does that mean? You solve SDDP, and that gives you a solution to the risk competitive equilibrium with everyone trading this risk. Well, how do you solve SDDP? Well, first of all, you've got to have a risk measure in SDDP. First of all, it can't be risk neutral because that would assume everyone was risk neutral, but they're not. So there's some residual risk that SDDP has to use. What is that? Well, it turns out you can derive that from the risk measures of all the agents. Effectively, the social planner uses a risk measure that's the risk attitude of the least risk-averse agent. So if there's one agent who's like a speculator who's risk neutral, effectively he's going to kind of trade all the risk of all the other guys, and everyone will work out as not caring about risk because that's all taken by the speculator. So it's kind of a slightly curious result, but it can be proved. And Ralph and Smears proved this a few years back, and then Michael Ferris and I proved a version for hydroelectricity that showed this all worked in a multi-stage setting as well. So, cut a long story short, which it is, I'm sorry, Anand, the long story has the conclusion that you can study a competitive equilibrium with risk-averse agents in a perfectly competitive market that's complete for risk, or nearly complete. It doesn't, it can be nearly complete. You have lots of instruments for trading, and you can then approximate or get close to completion of the market. You can study that by solving a social planning problem with risk aversion. And so you can take SDDP, develop a risk averse version of that, which Vita Dematis and I did a few years back, and solve that and see this is what an equilibrium will look like in this market. If it doesn't look like that, then you've got to make some changes to the market, because that's kind of the gold standard that you're trying to aim for. So that, I think, is where this risk optimization has a very nice interplay with studying markets and trying to understand how competitive they are, how they're behaving, and whether they're working well.
Mm-hmm. It can be hard to implement that, though.
Hard to implement the algorithm, or
the policies. The policies. I mean, because the players might not be, willing to cooperate. You know what I'm saying? So
that's a good point. So I think part of the question is monitoring. So in markets like Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, PJM in the US, there's very strict market monitoring. So because they solve this dispatch problem that assumes that people are offering in their short run marginal cost of generation, and their lots of thermal plant, and so there's a lot of checking to see whether people are doing that. In a hydro system, it's quite difficult to do that. It's difficult because actually the cost of offering in your generation for an agent, if you have stored water, is the opportunity cost of that water. And that relies on your view of the future. So you can take a position that your opportunity cost is sort of high, and that's my view of the future. So I know it's hard to legislate for that, but what it is easy to do is using a monitoring technique to say, this model tells us that if you have this risk measure and you're perfectly competitive, and we have enough instruments, which we think we do in the market, to trade your risk, then this is the sort of water value that you would use. But your water value is 3 times that. So please explain. What is it we're missing here in our interpretation of your behavior? So if it's they're exercising market power, then that's something you don't want to have, right? But if it says, well, we can't trade our risk for this particular event, then you can start thinking, yeah, well, actually that's an issue with the market design. We need to try and alleviate that. So I think there's it's really a diagnostic measure rather than a kind of a measure for that's supposed to entail dictating to the generators what they should do, right? So It's not prescriptive. It's rather than, it is a prescriptive model, but it's really saying this is what we should be seeing in a competitive market.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So Andy, to conclude this chapter of our conversation regarding stochastic programming, stochastic optimization, what's the story behind your involvement with Team New Zealand in the America's Cup?
So when I was in the UK as a student, I was very interested in the America's Cup. And when I was in the US at MIT, I went down to Newport and watched the Australians win the America's Cup off the US in 1983. So, I got very excited by this. And when I got back to New Zealand in 1986, I discovered that New Zealand had a team who were going to challenge for the America's Cup. And I was in the engineering school at the university, and some of the professors here were working with the team. So I made an effort to try and get involved with that group of people and help with various challenges. So the first challenge I worked on was in 1995 when Team New Zealand won the America's Cup off Dennis Conner in San Diego, and brought it back to New Zealand. And that was the project there was very simple. It was really trying to analyze how fast a yacht design would go by simulating in a computer. So that was some fairly straightforward optimization and coding. And then in 2000, we had the defense of the America's Cup, and with Shane Henderson now at Cornell and a student, we developed a simulation model of a match race, which was ended up being published in Operations Research. And this model enabled Team New Zealand to compare different designs of boats, racing them around a course in a simulation with random wind changes and so on, against a competing boat, to develop a kind of table on which boats would be better to choose to defend the cup. And the boat they eventually defended in was the one that we said they should choose. It was fairly obvious. I think they knew at the time it was going to be faster, but our simulations confirmed that. And they won the America's Cup again in 2000. And then in 2003, I did a project with the weather team on that defense of the America's Cup, where we were looking at how to decide which side of the course you should start off on at the start of the race. So we should go the left-hand side or the right-hand side. And this depended on finding an optimum route for a sailing boat to go from the start to the top mark of the course in a stochastic wind. So it was a kind of a stochastic shortest path problem, which we solved using dynamic programming and came up with kind of recommendations about which side of the course to go. Unfortunately, the boat that they chose was not very competitive for that regatta, and they lost the cup to the Swiss team who took it back to Europe. So I haven't been involved beyond that that regatta in the work.
Yeah, but this is very impressive. Were you involved in any other work in the context of sporting events?
Yeah. So I should mention this. Quite a while before the Team New Zealand work in 1980, in the late 1980s, I developed some software for one of the boats racing around the world in the Volvo. It's called used to be called the Volvo Ocean Race. I don't think it's called that anymore, but it used to be called the Whitbread Round the World Yacht Race back in the 1980s. And I developed some software for one of the boats in that, which wasn't terribly good. And what happened? Interesting story. I developed with a meteorologist to try and figure out what the best route to sail between two ports were, and the boat used it on the first leg, but the navigator on the boat actually missed a crucial weather forecast. So the information in the model was not really up to date, and they ended up not winning the race, winning that leg of the race. So they decided to abandon the software. Anyway, further down the track in 2003, some other people heard about this work that I'd done in the yachting route optimization, and said, can I develop a route for them to row a rowing boat across the Atlantic? It was in the two-handed Woodvale transatlantic rowing race. So this is where two guys sit in a boat for 42 days, rowing from the Canary Islands to Barbados. So I had an ex-student who I was working with at the time, and he and I put together a model based on observations of wind and current in the North Atlantic that would be provide a kind of stochastic shortest path for sailing or rowing a boat across the Atlantic. And as part of that, we produced some charts, laminated charts that they took on the rowing boat. They weren't allowed to have a computer assistance from the shore, or they didn't have enough power to run a computer to figure out, do any optimization on board. They had these charts which effectively encapsulated what an optimum policy would be given them being at a certain location in the ocean. They could use these charts to figure out where to row. And they used them, and they ended up winning the race in a record time. And I have to say the record they broke in 2003 is still the world record for two people rowing across the Atlantic from Canary Islands to Barbados. So the routing policy that we gave them encapsulated in these charts was very useful.
Wow, that's so cool. So you were directly involved with the world-breaking record of a very relevant event, and the record still stands to this date. It's
The
absolutely
record still
fantastic.
stands, I believe. Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that it was a great project, and the very interesting project, because we couldn't use a computer, so we had to come up with very simple rules of thumb that they could use. And of course, we know policies for dynamic programs are essentially policies. They're rules of thumb. If you see yourself in this part of the ocean, this is the wind you're seeing, and this is the current you're seeing at this point, then this is the direction you should row.
Yeah. Wow. I'm very impressed about this. This is fantastic. So Andy, now let's talk about your very successful collaboration with Norske Skog from Norway that helped the company save 100 million annually.
Yeah, that was a
$100
very $100 million US dollars. Yes. Well, in the Edelman contest, you might know you have to have the savings that you claim audited by someone and officially kind of recognized by the auditor. And that was the number they came up with. I didn't realize it at the time we were doing the work that was the sorts of savings that we were going to create from this project. The work went way back to the middle of the 1990s. I worked as a consultant with an ex-student who was one of the energy managers at their mill, and I was thinking of how to purchase electricity for them, and he came up with this question of, well, we need to figure out a product mix for our newsprint. We've got different grades of newsprint we're making, and can you help us do that? So he and I developed an ample model, ample simplex model called Pivot, which was a MIP, which determined for their plant in New Zealand which grades of paper they should make and how to where to sell them. And that model was sat in the company for a number of years as some software that wasn't really used by the company, even though they paid for it. They didn't really use it until they acquired some other paper mills. The company was at the time called Fletcher Paper. They acquired some other paper mills in Australia, and they needed to rationalize how they produced newsprint across the two companies. So now they acquired new paper mills with new capacities and so on. They had to run Pivot, so we extended Pivot to include the Australian mills, and they used it to say, okay, we can use this to rationalize our the way we make paper in Australia and New Zealand. And then about 2 years after that, the company Fletcher Paper was acquired by Norske Skog, the Norwegian newsprint company, who have mills around the world. And they learned about this Pivot model and said, can we do something for Europe? And so we developed a European version of it. And then around 2007, they said to us, actually, newsprint is really declining. We have a very difficult situation in newsprint because people are not reading newspapers anymore, and the internet has grown enormously, and so we're getting less and less demand for newsprint. We need to close down some mills, and we're going to close some mills in Europe. But there was quite a debate amongst the Norwegians about which mill should be closed in Europe, and they had some difficulties with some of the union officials in Norway who said, we object to you closing down this mill in Norway. So Rune Gessing, who was one of the executives at Norske Skog, said, we will develop a model for you that decides what mills to close. If you agree with the inputs in the model, and the model says we close this mill in Norway, you will agree with that. And they agreed, yes. If you do a model and we'll just audit the inputs, then we'll decide. So we built a model for the world for Norske Skog of all their mills, paper mills, and it was a big MIP, and said, which mills should you close down to save on fixed costs and so on and so forth. And it turned out that actually the European mills were not the ones that chose to close, even though they were quite expensive, and they weren't making much margin, and the Norwegians couldn't figure this out. They said, why is it not choosing these mills? And the key thing was that once you close a mill, you can't just look at what the other mills were doing. You have to resolve the MIP again to reorganize everything to make it efficient. And so once you resolve it, you get a completely different solution. And once you do that completely different solution, you find that actually it would be better to close a different mill to get that different solution, right? Not the ones you first thought of. So in fact, they ended up closing, or they were going to close some mills in Korea, but ended up selling those mills to a consortium of Korean owners, and I think it was Morgan Stanley. I'm not quite sure of that, but I think it was Morgan Stanley bought those mills for quite a good, reasonable price. They sold them. And so how does that save $100 million a year? Well, the deal closed a week before Lehman Brothers went bust in 2008. They got the cash and basically got rid of debt. And then, of course, the GFC happened. And if they'd still had those mills and that level of debt, they claimed they would have gone broke. So they saved themselves, effectively saved the company by that decision. So was it our model? I think that would be flattering to say we saved the company that amount. It was a huge dose of luck involved, but it was a very nice project. And I think without the model, they probably would have made a different decision and maybe not saved as much money as they did.
That's incredible. So, Andy, changing topics completely, I realized that you did not publish a single journal paper for about 5 consecutive years during the 90s. Was there a special reason for this hiatus?
Well, those people who know me well will know the reason. So I should share that with you. My wife and I had triplets in 1994, and so I needed to do quite a bit of consulting work to pay for their costs, and not to mention helping with my wife when they were babies. I have to say my wife's very competent and very generous, so I can't pretend to have been a great help. But I have to say, we were very busy during that period, so I didn't have much time for writing papers in those 5 years before the kids went to school. So that's the reason for the hiatus.
Yeah, now it makes total sense. How many kids do you have in total?
We have 4 children. Yeah, they were born in 94, so that triplets are 29. I have one daughter who's 31. So yeah, they're quite a lot older.
Okay, so you already had a 2-year-old kid when you got the triplets.
We did it. Yeah, it was pretty fun.
Wow. Yeah. Okay, Andy, what do you intend to do in the coming years? Any plans of retirement? You're still young.
No plans to retire. No, still enjoying my work here in Auckland, and got some good PhD students. I'm working with Michael Ferris quite a lot. We're still working on problems of renewable energy and decarbonisation, and thinking about some of the interesting mathematical issues underlying those problems. How to make it work in markets. I think this decarbonisation is going to be a very fruitful area for OR. So my goal is to continue trying to contribute to that as long as people think I can. So that'll be me for the next 4 or 5 years at least, I think.
Okay. So Andy, it was great to have you here. It was a fantastic conversation. I learned a lot. And also, I was very impressed about your achievements, your practical achievements, other than publishing papers, and it's been great. So thanks really.
Thanks, Anand. I appreciate the opportunity, and it's been good fun. So yeah, and I hope we can meet in person sometime.
Yeah, for sure. We're both in the southern hemisphere, but we're literally a world apart of each other. So. And of course, I don't have to say that you're most welcome to visit Brazil and João Pessoa, our place. So thank you so much. It's been great, and all the best. Take care, and let's meet one of these days. Ciao. Bye.
Sure. Bye.